billions of years really matter? Well, the idea of evolution is inextricably linked to the idea of billions of years. According to the biblical chronology, Earth is around 6,000 years old, which directly contradicts the proposed 4.6 billion years that is generally accepted. More specifically, the difference is 4,599,994,000 years. A rather huge difference, I'd say. To put this in perspective, try holding your breath for just 1 minute. Easy or not? Let's say that the 1 minute is equal to the young 6,000 year age of the Earth. If you want to demonstrate the hypothesized old age of the Earth of 4.6 billion years, you would have to hold your breath for 1.5 years. Clearly, you are not going to survive. In the same way, the evolutionary hypothesis could never survive without the idea of billions of years. This is why the age of the Earth is most definitely important. All of the scientific estimates regarding the age of the Earth and the universe requires the acceptance of a whole range of assumptions, preconceived ideas, before their idea can hypothetically work. The most important of these for secular scientists is uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism and uniformity, it all sounds very similar, but they differ completely. So let's see if we can make some sense of this. And again, we come back to preconceived ideas. The evolutionist assumption of uniformitarianism means that they believe and teach that the processes and rate at which things are occurring in the present is exactly the same as it has always been in the past. The present is the key to the past. So they propose that the existing forces have worked uniformly since the beginning of the universe until now, and that all phenomena can hereby be explained. Initially, this was called gradualism. Consequently, they propose that the rate of erosion and layer formation presently is exactly the same as it was in the past. There's no evidence for this. It is an assumption. Uniformitarianism is actually atheism masked as science, because it pointedly and specifically excludes major miraculous events in the past, such as the supernatural creation and the biblical flood. The historian and philosopher of science, William Whewell, coined the term uniformitarianism for this philosophy in an anonymous review of Lyell's second volume. Uniformitarianism is not a refutation of biblical teaching on creation and the flood, but a dogmatic refusal to consider them as even possible explanations for the rocks and fossils we observe. Let's now look at uniformity. God, who is consistent and omnipresent, stands outside of time because he created time, and he revealed himself to us through his word. In Genesis 8:22, he promised that there would be regularity, consistency, for example, in the days, the seasons, and the yearly cycle. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease. In other words, the future would have a degree of regularity, consistency, uniformity, which is why we can expect natural laws to remain constant over time and space. This consistency, regularity, forms the logical foundation of science, whereby we can conclude that the universe is compiled in a logical and orderly manner, and that it functions according to specific mathematical laws that remain consistent over time and space. Uniformity in nature is what enables scientists to make successful predictions, for example, by calculating the positions of planets, moons, and asteroids in the future. It would therefore be reasonable to expect that the results of a specific experiment that was carried out in the past would produce the same results when repeated in future, if the conditions remain the same. Without uniformity in nature, these types of predictions would be impossible, and science would be non-existent. Hebrews 1:3 teaches how God is upholding all things by the power of his word of his power. More specifically, it is through the direct power of God that the universe continues to exist and function. Colossians 1:17 explains how Christ holds all things together. And he is before all things, and in him all things consist. The NIV says, in him all things hold together. This means that the planets, stars, and even the atoms are held together by the power of God. Gravitation, electromagnetic, and nuclear forces are simply descriptions of the way in which God upholds the universe. In the same way, the laws of physics are certainly no replacement for the power of God, but merely an example thereof. The fact that we can, according to Genesis 8:22, expect natural laws to be constant over time and space does not imply that the current conditions, the processes, and the rate of change have always been the same as taught in uniformitarianism. In fact, the Bible clearly indicates that this was definitely not the case, with specific reference to the fact that there was once a world without sin, but today it is not so. Furthermore, there was a time when the whole world was covered by a flood, but today it is not so. The Bible teaches that God created the universe in a different way from the way he maintains it today. This creative work was completed by day 7, and that is why it is clear that he is no longer doing what he was doing during creation week, because creation was a one-time event. The Bible thus teaches uniformity but denies uniformitarianism. Shortly after uniformitarianism was presented in opposition to biblical catastrophism, such as the flood, and the majority of people, including the church, was convinced that the geologic layers provided evidence for long ages, evidence was discovered which supported catastrophic events. Instead of reconsidering the reigning uniformitarian view, gradualism, which implies slow, gradual processes, the term uniformitarianism was simply redefined to include the occasional catastrophic events. The opposite of uniformitarianism is catastrophism. The creationist believes that there was an immensely catastrophic event in the past, the biblical flood, which led to the deposition of the sedimentary layers within only a few months. An enormous number of animals and plants were buried in the process to form the very same fossils that we will be learning about today. Furthermore, it implies a period of significantly accelerated rates of erosion when the water streamed off the continents towards the end of the flood. The conditions and consequently the processes was certainly not always this constant as taught by uniformitarianism. Now let's just briefly look at rocks and how they are classified. There are many different types of rocks in our world, and except for meteorites, no new types have arisen. Meteorites are rocks from space that fall to planet Earth every now and then. There are 3 main rock types: igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic rocks. According to old Earth scientists, igneous rocks formed when molten rocks or magma solidified and cooled over a very long time. Sedimentary rocks consist of particles of mostly sand, gravel, and clay, which hardened and cooled over a very long time to form flat rock layers or strata. Metamorphic rocks are igneous and sedimentary rocks that have undergone a metamorphosis or a change due to temperature or pressure or both, much like dough changes into bread over a very long time. How do young Earth creationists explain these rocks? Granite, an igneous rock, was formed rapidly. We will look at the work done by Dr. Robert Gentry as well as the rate scientists on polonium-218 in a later lecture. The sedimentary rock layers were mainly and rapidly formed during the biblical flood, when sand, gravel, and clay formed various combinations and were laid down in flat layers or strata. Fossils, plant and animal remains are only found in the sedimentary strata because they were buried there during the flood. Some sedimentary layers may also have been formed during creation week but will not contain any fossils. Metamorphic layers were also formed rapidly due to geological processes associated with the flood. Just to get some perspective, this figure shows the diameter of the Earth from the outside to the inside. The Earth consists mainly of a crust, a mantle, and a core. If the distance from the Earth's crust is measured right to the center of the core, the distance or the radius is 6,370 kilometers. The different types of rocks we've just discussed, the igneous, the sedimentary, and the metamorphic rocks all occur in and on the relatively thin crust of the Earth. And this is represented by the green mountains on the right-hand side. Sedimentary layers cover 75 to 80% of the Earth's surface and consist of rock layers of various combinations of sand, gravel, and clay. These layers are often explained as the geologic column or the fossil record. Why? Because it is only in these layers that we find fossils. Charles Lyell is generally seen as the father of the geologic column since he released the book Principles of Geology in 1830. Hereby, it is assumed and accepted that very long periods were necessary for each geologic layer to form. It has been proposed that the geologically different sedimentary layers was a representation of the gradual environmental and climatic changes organisms were subjected to. The effect of these changes on the organisms led to the progressive transformation or evolution of species. According to old Earth scientists, at some point in the past, each layer formed the top layer of the Earth. As plants and animals evolved and died, they were slowly, very, very slowly, millions of years slowly, covered by sediments. Each successive generation was formed on the previous flat layer. This process was repeated and repeated until these flat, pancake-like sedimentary layers were formed that we can observe today. Remember, flat layers imply that for millions of years, practically no erosion took place. But have you ever seen what a dirt or a gravel road looks like after one decent rain shower? We'll talk about this a little bit later again. Now we have to ask, is the sedimentary layers of the Earth really so clearly defined and categorized as shown in the geologic table? Is this exactly how it is represented in Earth's sedimentary strata? It's important to understand that the geologic column is only a hypothetical classification scheme based on selected sedimentary layers in Europe. Therefore, this is not a physical column, but rather the interpretation of Earth's sedimentary layers based on assumptions of an old Earth, uniformitarianism. However, this classification is used flexibly to classify sedimentary strata all around the world. But there are serious problems with this column and its interpretation. The order of the layers is often wrong, for example at Red Rock Canyon in Nevada. Only a small number of the 10 geologic periods are present in any specific area. In fact, the areas where all 10 periods have been assigned represents less than 0.4% of the Earth's surface, or 1% if the ocean basins are excluded. The fact that it is the exception rather than the rule makes it very difficult to believe in the existence of a geologic column that is absent 99% of the time. The presence or absence of the periods is not the main issue, but rather the fact that there is no place on Earth where the geologic column is complete in terms of having the maximum thickness of the sedimentary layers attributed to each geologic period. The thickness of the layers, even in those areas where all 10 periods have been assigned, represents only a fraction, 8 to 16% of the total thickness of the hypothetical geologic column. The thickness of the column is supposed to be at least 160 kilometers. However, worldwide, the average thickness of the local geologic column is about 1.6 kilometers, while in some places the column has a thickness of 0. It remains an undeniable fact that in reality, most of the column is absent. In other words, the real presence of Charles Lyell's hypothetical geologic column is as scarce as bird poo in a cuckoo clock. If you really wanted to see a standard geologic column with your own eyes, there's only one place in the whole world where you will find it, and that is in a textbook. A typical textbook describing Earth's history will present the column in a geologic table such as this one. Notice there are 3 main eras: the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic eras. Lyell's book became the foundation of the modern Old Earth geologic and evolutionary view of the sedimentary strata of the Earth. The geologic column is hereby divided into the Precambrian era, right at the bottom, followed by the Cambrian period, which forms part of the Paleozoic era, followed by the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic eras, each of them which is characterized by different fossil collections. According to Old Earth scientists, we should observe fossils of simple organisms at the bottom and complex ones at the top. The Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic eras together is also referred to as the Phanerozoic eon, which simply means visible life. However, the Cambrian layer right at the bottom represents a huge problem to evolutionary paleontologists, because instead of containing only simple unicelled organisms, it contains enormous numbers of complex multicellular organisms. It's also referred to as the Cambrian explosion, because of the sudden appearance of huge numbers of complex creatures without any evidence whatsoever that they evolved from anything else. The Cambrian explosion is the most dramatic refutation of the tree of life idea, because it reveals how the body plans for virtually every living animal appeared with astonishing suddenness, and not slowly and gradually as postulated by Darwin. All 32 mammal orders appear abruptly and fully formed in the fossil record. In 1944, the evolutionary paleontologist George Gaylord Simpson wrote the following: "The earliest and most primitive members of every order already have the basic ordinal characters, and in no case is an approximately continuous series from one order to another known. In most cases, the break is so sharp and the gap so large that the origin of the order is speculative and much disputed." Now, there's little to overturn this today. The statement is as true as it was in 1944. The geologic column that we see here on the left, excluding the Precambrian era right at the bottom, actually represents a very tiny fraction of the complete geologic timescale. So tiny that it is only represented by the green, blue, and yellow portions in the circle diagram. The Precambrian stretches right back to 3.8 billion years. Percentage-wise, the Precambrian spans nearly 90% of the total assumed Earth history. Let's investigate this in a bit more detail to see how it makes absolutely no sense at all. Old Earth scientists postulate an age of 4.6 billion years for the Earth. According to the evolutionary model, life must have evolved around 3.5 to 3.8 billion years ago, but remained in a relatively simple, single-celled conditions for almost 3 billion years. Then suddenly, in less than 100 million years, almost all the animal phylums, about 40 of them, appeared in the Cambrian explosion. This is the green part of the circle diagram. While almost nothing evolved after that, the blue part, and most of the mammal phylums appeared within only 12 million years. That's the tiny yellow portion. If we represent the history of life taking place in a 24-hour period, it becomes more clear. When we start the clock at 24 hours, which represents 3.8 billion years, nothing but simple, single-celled organisms appear. The clock continues ticking. 6 hours, 12 hours, 18 hours, the same thing. No change, no evolution whatsoever. At about the 21st hour, in the space of about 2 minutes, all the major animal life forms appear in the form they currently have in the present. Less than 2 minutes in a 24-hour period. That is how sudden the Cambrian explosion was. So in a geological instant, the animal kingdom leaped from small, simple organisms to extraordinary creatures with spinal cords and compound eyes. In other words, the fossils indicate very little to no evolutionary activity in the first 5/6 of the geologic timescale before the Cambrian. Stromatolites are regarded by many as the oldest fossils on Earth. The oldest is claimed to be about 3.5 billion years old. Stromatolites are interpreted as the remains of colonies of blue-green algae, more accurately called cyanobacteria. Within the evolutionary framework, one would expect radical changes within these colonies over such an enormously huge time span. But remarkably, they still look exactly the same as the ones today. For example, from Bitter Springs rocks in central Australia, it is clear that fossil stromatolites look exactly the same as the species we currently observe. Stromatolites are classic examples of living fossils, which represents huge problems for evolutionists because they provide such stunning examples of how evolution has never taken place. They also call into serious question the evolutionary time frame. Some people try to downplay the significance of living fossils by arguing that when something is well adapted to its environment, it doesn't need to change. But this would require the environment to remain unchanged for up to 3.5 billion years. This argument is feeble at its best and cannot be applied to stromatolites since supposedly radical environmental changes occurred, including the arrival of new predators and parasites during the 3.5 billion years of alleged evolutionary time. How is it possible for some bacteria or simple organisms to have evolved all the way into humans within only 600 million years, while other organisms show absolutely no change for up to 3,000 million years? There are various, more than 90 so-called antique species that have identical modern versions. Let's now have a closer look at fossils. A fossil is the remains of a once living organism. It includes plants and animals and their products, shells, teeth, bones, or complete skeletons, as well as their tracks. Some fossils have been especially well preserved in their original condition in tar and resin. Other fossils no longer contain the organism's original matter, but consist of minerals that penetrated the organism to take on its form. More precisely, the organism has been petrified, with the minerals in the exact shape of the organism or a part thereof, but the organism itself is missing in action. Researchers have found that chicken bones and wood can be replaced with minerals in a mere 5 to 10 years, while a large dinosaur bone may take hundreds of years to completely mineralize. It all depends on the burial conditions over the years. Many dinosaur remains are still not completely turned to stone. In fact, more than half of the fossil is still original bone, not stone. Some fossil fish still have a fishy smell when first discovered. Some of the plants buried during the flood are not fossilized either. Large amounts of wood from trees that were growing at the same time as dinosaurs were preserved, but not fossilized. Since the flood happened only about 4,500 years ago, these kind of discoveries are not surprising. According to the evolutionary hypothesis, however, plants and animals died over millions of years, fell to the ground, and slowly changed into fossils. They were very gradually covered by dust and sediments. It must have been a truly miraculous event, because how could this have happened over such a long time span without them being scavenged or decaying? What is really required for fossilization to occur is the following: a sudden death, a sudden burial, and enormous pressure to ensure sealing so that no oxygen is present that would enable decomposition, and for the sediments to harden quickly. Interestingly, it reads as follows on the accompanying information board in the Karoo National Park, South Africa. Petrified tree trunks preserve fine details of the original wood. This was completely replaced by silica following rapid burial within sediment, for example, after major floods. The specific order of arrangement in the fossil record, from bottom to top, is interpreted by evolutionists as a progression from simple, in biological terms, to complex organisms. In other words, the evolution from invertebrates to vertebrates, such as fish and amphibians and reptiles. And this is held as primary evidence that evolution is a fact. Keep in mind, though, that there's no such thing as a simple organism. Even organisms in the lowest part of the fossil record are complex, for example, trilobites. It is, however, an arrangement of non-free-swimming marine organisms to free-swimming marine organisms to land-living forms. The fossil records provide the only evidence of plants and animals that lived in ancient times, and for this reason is very valuable to the evolutionist in attempting to prove their hypothesis. In between these fossils, scientists should be able to find all the examples they could ever need to provide proof that one kind changed into another kind. If evolution is the reason for all life on Earth, there ought to be millions upon millions of half-evolved fossil life forms as evidence, the so-called missing links. For example, there ought to be fossils of half fish, half frogs, half reptiles, half birds, and of course something like a half ape, half human. 1 Corinthians 15:39. All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of animals, another of fish, and another of birds. However, contrary to what evolutionists want you to believe, the fossil record provides clear evidence that evolution has never taken place. Many people have worked very hard all through the 19th century to find some sort of evidence to support the evolutionary theory in the sedimentary strata. After more than 170 years of collection and detailed studies of fossils, scientists have still only discovered clear, separate kinds. There has never been any evidence of any kind of organism changing into another kind of organism. That is what the evolutionists mean when they are speaking of the missing links or transitional forms. Even though paleontologists seem to know exactly how these missing links should look like in their imagination, they simply cannot find them. Why not? Because they don't exist. There are more than 100 million fossils of 250,000 different species recorded in museums and other collections around the world. Now that should be enough to find that missing link. Keep in mind that dinosaurs were not transitional forms, but rather a unique and specific group of animals that became extinct mainly due to the flood and its effects. Extinction provides no evidence for evolution. We'll discuss dinos in a later lecture. In fact, if evolution was possible, don't you think there ought to be far more transitional forms than end forms in the fossil record? By now we know exactly what evolution means. That one kind, a fish, should change into another kind, a frog. Let's pretend that the diamond shape is one kind, which must now change into another kind, a circle. If it were possible for something like this to happen, there should be an enormous number of transitional forms in between that gradually, very, very gradually, millions of years slowly change into something like a circle. In other words, there should be far more transitional than end forms. Evolution requires transitional forms, but paleontology simply don't provide them. Charles Darwin was worried about the fact that the fossil record provided so little evolution for his hypothesis. In his book on the origin of species, he even asks the question himself why the geologic layers are not filled with these transitional forms, and he describes this as the most obvious and serious objection against his hypothesis. Let's read exactly what he said. But just in proportion as this process of extermination has acted on an enormous scale, so must the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. This is perhaps the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against the theory. While Darwin predicted that the fossil record would still yield a huge number of transitional forms in future, more than 170 years later, we still sit with only a handful extremely dubious examples. Evolutionists anticipate innumerable transitional forms between kinds, but these have never been found. Creationists anticipate gaps between kinds, and this is 100% consistent with the fossils discovered. Now, the best way to show you exactly what is going on in the fossil record and how it is interpreted is to quote evolutionary paleontologists directly on this matter. The evolutionist Colin Patterson, former senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, wrote a book for the museum named Evolution. Now keep in mind that Patterson was in control of millions of fossils and is very familiar with them. The creationist Luther Sutherland wrote to Patterson and asked him why he had not included a single photo of a transitional form in his book. His amazing confession, Patterson's amazing confession, can also be read in its entirety in Sutherland's book, Darwin's Enigma. I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. You suggest that an artist should be used to visualize such transformations, but where would he get that information from? I could not honestly provide it. And if I were to leave it to artistic license, would that not mislead the reader? So damning was this quote about the scarcity of transitional forms in the fossil record that creationists are often accused of misquoting Dr. Patterson. So let's clarify this. Patterson then referred to Stephen Jay Gould, the now deceased professor of paleontology from Harvard University, by saying, "Yet Gould and the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. You say that I should at least show a photo of the fossil from which each type of organism was derived. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument." An anti-creationist skeptic then wrote to Patterson for clarification about the comments he made in Sutherland's book. Patterson replied that the quote was accurate in its reproduction, but that the interpretation was faulty because he had also written, The reason is that statements about ancestry and descent are not applicable in the fossil record. Is Archaeopteryx the ancestor of all birds? Perhaps yes, perhaps no. There is no way of answering the question. Well, precisely. Why then do evolutionary textbooks almost universally declare Archaeopteryx to be a transitional form? But the issue goes much deeper. Patterson's revision seemed to claim that all he meant with his original quote was that it is impossible to determine whether any candidate fossils, in other words, that might have the appearance of transitional forms, that they were actually real transitional forms, and not that there was a scarcity or absence of in-between fossil forms in the fossil record. In other words, they might look like missing links, but how can we know for sure? But this was not all he had said. His referral to Stephen Jay Gould and the American Museum people, who are very well known for specifically admitting to the rarity of transitional forms, cannot be ignored. They actually proposed a theory of evolution in jumps to explain away the fact that links seem to be absent. Gould even said in another place, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. In any local area, a species does not arise gradually by the gradual transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once and fully formed. He also said, Darwin's arguments still persist as the favored escape of most paleontologists from the embarrassment of a record that seems to show so little of evolution. We fancy ourselves as the only true students of life's history, yet to preserve our favorite account of evolution by natural selection, we view our data as so bad that we never see the very process we profess to study. You see, not only are the transitional forms missing, the whole chain is missing. Please note that Gould and Patterson were committed evolutionists, and even by interpreting the record through their evolutionary lenses, they admitted that it was extremely rare to find transitional forms, not that it was impossible in principle. Creationists, of course, claim that there are none. But even candidates for transitional forms are clearly so rare that Patterson was able to refer to Gould by saying that there were, for all practical purposes, no transitional forms. Yet, a straightforward understanding of new Darwinism would suggest that there should be many more transitional forms than the informs we see today. So one would expect transitional forms to dominate the fossil record. The context of Sunderland's letter to Patterson is important. He simply asked why Patterson didn't show even a single picture of any proposed transitional form anywhere in the book. And Patterson's reply made it abundantly clear that if he did that, it would come down to storytelling. It's easy enough to make up stories of how one form gave rise to another, and to find reasons why the stages should be favored by natural selection. But such stories are not part of science, for there is no way of putting them to the test. Evolutionists often make these frank admissions among themselves, but they are generally not for publication. So in response to the anti-creationist asking for clarification from Patterson, Patterson replied as follows: I seem fated continuously to make a fool of myself with creationists. I hope that by now I have learned to be more circumspect in dealing with creationists, cryptic or overt. But I still maintain that skepticism is the scientist's duty, however much the stance may expose us to ridicule. He seems to be saying that it's okay to doubt, as long as we don't let the creationists know about it. Being a world-renowned fossil expert, his frank admissions were very embarrassing to the evolutionary supporters, even to himself it seems, but more devastating revelations were to come from Dr. Patterson. During a public lecture presented at New York City's American Museum of Natural History on 5 November 1981, Patterson dropped a bombshell among his peers that evening, who became very angry and emotional. And here are some extracts of what he had said. One morning I woke up and it struck me that I had been working on this stuff, evolution, for 20 years, and there was not one thing I knew about it. One of the reasons I started taking this anti-evolutionary view, well, let's call it non-evolutionary, was that last year I had a sudden realization. It was quite a shock that one could be misled for so long. I've tried putting a simple question to various people and groups of people. Can you tell me anything you know about evolution? Any one thing that you think is true? I tried that question on the geology staff in the Field Museum of Natural History, and the only answer I got was silence. I tried it on the members of the evolutionary morphology seminar in the University of Chicago, and all I got there was silence for a long time. And then eventually one person said, yes, I do know one thing. It ought not to be taught in high school. I completely agree. I want to emphasize that this man is an absolute expert in his subject field. Dare I say, more qualified and knowledgeable than most people who so passionately defend evolution, especially on social media. And although these are only excerpts from his very frank and startling lecture, it's plain to see that he had very serious doubts. Sadly, his experience and expertise as holder of one of the most prestigious scientific positions in the world did not grant him immunity from the pressure for having dared to express his doubts about the reigning evolutionary worldview. The more one studies paleontology, the more certain one becomes that evolution is based on faith alone. Now, when looking at the geologic column or fossil record from a biblical perspective, things look very different. Genesis 6 to 9 describes a worldwide flood that covered the whole earth. What would you expect to find if such a flood really occurred? I would expect to find evidence in the form of millions of dead and buried plants and animals. Conditions during the flood were ideal for the fossilization of millions of animals and plants. During this event, muddy sediments consisting of pebbles and gravel, clay and sand were deposited in successive layers, while simultaneously burying plants and animals to form the fossils and thus the fossil record. Keep in mind that the sedimentary strata cover 75 to 80% of the earth. Fossils provide evidence of a catastrophic disaster. Do you still remember the recipe for fossil formation? A sudden death, a sudden burial, and enormous pressure to enable sealing so that no oxygen is present and the sediments can harden rapidly. Under extremely high pressure, these sediments hardened after the flood water receded to form the sedimentary layers we see today. The geologic layers are a representation of the zones wherein the animals and plants were buried. Clearly, it is not an evolutionary, but rather an ecological arrangement. We would expect more or less the same general ecological relationships before as after the flood. The distribution of organisms today consists of relatively simple organisms such as bacteria and algae that live down to great depths within the rock layers. This corresponds to the rare simple fossils in the lower Precambrian layers. This is followed by the Cambrian marine organisms. These are organisms which lived in the low pre-flood seas. However, it is interpreted by long ages as the Cambrian explosion, since most of the animal phyla, which happens to be entirely marine, appear suddenly, without any evolutionary ancestors. We now know that they appear suddenly because they were suddenly buried during the flood. Many varied kinds of terrestrial organisms first appear at about the same level. The rising water of the flood destroyed the lowest land level areas of the pre-flood world, preserving the organisms as fossils. In other words, the Phanerozoic, which means visible life, contains many fossils in the lower portions, and almost all organisms are marine, while the upper portions, the tertiary, is dominated by fossils of terrestrial animals with varying proportions in between. So the general distribution pattern is similar to present ecology. Small, single-celled organisms in Earth's deeper rocks, abundant marine organisms in the sea, and landforms at high levels. We therefore observe very simple forms for most of the Precambrian that lie just below an enormous variety of complex animals, and this challenges the common supposition of general evolutionary progression over time. In fact, 95% of the fossils in the fossil record consist of shallow marine organisms such as corals and shellfish. The remaining 5% consist of plant and animal fossils, as well as all the other invertebrate fossils, including insects. The vertebrate animals forms a very small part, only 5% of the remaining 5%. In other words, 0.25% of the fossil record. In general, some geologists assume that the fine layers of sedimentary strata proves that the layers, the one flat upon the other, were formed over millions of years. Now, I've asked this question before. Have you ever noticed what a dirt road looks like after one proper rain shower? It's full of trenches and bumps and definitely not flat. How then do we explain the fact that there is no evidence whatsoever of erosion, soil formation, excavation activity by animals, or root growth in between these layers? It's important to remember that Lyell and other scientists decided on the high ages for the layers of the geologic column during the 19th century. At that stage, they knew nothing about radiometric dating methods. Do you think there is evidence available in the present to prove that sedimentary layers can form rapidly? Of course there is. The eruption of Mount St. Helens volcano in the USA provides clear evidence to geologists that a catastrophic event can produce geologic features much faster than over the generally assumed millions of years. On the morning of 18 May 1980, the northern part of Mount St. Helens completely collapsed due to heavy internal pressure, which led to a massive landslide. This exposed the volcano, causing it to erupt. In this catastrophic event, the top 400 meters of the mountain was completely blown off. The magma reached a temperature of 930 degrees Celsius, causing the snow to explode into steam. Ken Ham explains that the amount of energy released in the process was equivalent to that of 400 million tons of TNT, about 33,000 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs. The steam explosions blasted northwards at more than 300 meters per second, while flinging large pieces of rock kilometers high into the air. Giant plumes of ash and volcanic gas hung over the crater. In fact, more than 1 cubic kilometer of volcanic ash was spread throughout the air and blown up as high as 19 kilometers. Black clouds of fine, hot ash mixed with gas, blasting at high speed from the volcano, formed a pyroclastic flow. Taz Walker explains in his article, Learning the Lessons from Mount St. Helens, how this ash-laden and heavier than air flow surged down the side of the volcano and along the river valley at more than 160 kilometers per hour. Surprisingly, an 8-meter thick sedimentary layer consisting of fine layers called laminae was deposited within only 3 hours. One would expect a catastrophic high-speed ash flow to form a uniform, well-mixed deposit. However, the Mount St. Helens eruption clearly showed that the coarse and fine material automatically separated into thin, distinct bands, and that such deposits can form very rapidly from fast-flowing fluids, liquids, and gases instead of slowly over millions of years as generally assumed. This was also verified in laboratory experiments and provides powerful evidence that finely layered sandstone deposits, for example, can form rapidly. Closer to the volcano, the trees, the rocks, the ground were completely ripped out. Further away, the trees were blown over by the violence of this event. An enormous amount of debris was dumped into Spirit Lake, which led to a terrifying 260-meter high wave, like a tsunami. This wave uprooted approximately 1 million trees on the northern side, dragging them into the lake to form a gigantic floating log mat. The lake was almost completely covered by it, as can be seen on the photo. Now, log mats like this would have been common during Noah's flood. The logs in Spirit Lake rubbed together and scraped off the bark, as well as the remaining branches, which sank to the bottom of the lake, forming an organic layer of peat. This is a plausible mechanism for how coal deposits could have formed during the biblical flood. As the logs became waterlogged, they tipped and floated vertically, eventually sinking to the bottom with a heavy root end penetrating the sediment and peat layers, the trees being buried upright. Compare this with a fossilized polystrate tree on the left. As more logs sank, they formed a forest of vertical logs at different levels on the bottom. Some trees were also engulfed by the landslide and carried kilometers down to protrude from the ground. The bottom of Spirit Lake lifted by approximately 90 meters because of the debris, which also caused the water level to rise and the surface area of the lake to almost double in size. It is said that the Specimen Creek Formation in Yellowstone National Park contains about 50 layers of upright polystrate trees. Poly means many, strata, many trees. Evolutionists claim that each layer is the remains of a forest that was subsequently buried by volcanic ash and other debris. But think about this for a moment. Will a dead upright tree remain upright for hundreds, thousands, even millions of years and patiently wait for the sediments to cover it, without any signs of weathering, decay, or even toppling over? Of course not. Yet, upright polystrate trees are still being discovered cutting across many geologic layers with ages that supposedly differ by millions of years. There are no signs of any root growth in between these layers. In fact, these trees don't even have any of their roots attached anymore. Why not? Because they did not grow there, they were buried there, some even upside down. The catastrophic burial can be best explained by considering the flood. On a smaller scale, the catastrophic eruption of Mount St. Helens demonstrated how thousands of trees were dumped and sequentially buried upright in the sediments of Spirit Lake. Ongoing eruptions eroded the thick sediments that was dumped at the base of the volcano. This produced various channels and even canyons. One was called Little Grand Canyon. A mud flow caused after a small eruption melted the snow within the crater. The mud built up behind debris and then burst through it to carve out the canyon in a single day. This canyon is about 1/40th the size of the Grand Canyon, 45 meters wide with 40-meter high sidewalls. Even more dramatic is Lewitt Canyon. It's about 30 meters deep, and it was formed when the mud flows eroded through old hard volcanic rock called andesite within only a few months. Step Canyon formed in the same way and is even deeper at 180 meters. Little Grand Canyon, Leeward Canyon, Step Canyon provide clear evidence of rapid sedimentary layer formation and how these layers can harden within a few years. The higher the pressure, the faster they harden. From this, it is also very clear that canyons can form much faster than you are being told. Burlington Canyon in the northwest of the USA provide further evidence that ravines and canyons certainly don't need millions of years to form. This canyon was formed in less than 6 days after water flow had to be diverted into a diversion ditch leading to the nearby Pine Creek. Before this, the ditch was quite small, about 3 meters deep and 1.8 meters wide, often with no water at all. Due to abnormally high flow spring rains, the underlying stratum collapsed. The extremely high pressure and velocity as well as headward erosion changed what used to be an insignificant ditch into a gully. And the gully became a gulch, and the gulch became another miniature Grand Canyon. Now, when looking at those massive ravines and canyons in the world today, such as the Fish River Canyon, which is the largest canyon in Africa, or the Grand Canyon in America, wondering how it was formed, the question we need to ask is this: was it a little water and a lot of time, or a lot of water and a little time? These huge canyons and ravines are best explained by considering the flood of Noah. You are given the usual general explanation that that little river flowing right at the bottom of the canyon was responsible for carving out and shaping the major canyons. That's a huge job for such a little river. Although more secular geologists are today proposing that canyons were formed by various floods over a very long time, the general public is mostly not informed. Do not make the mistake of thinking that these scientists are referring to the biblical flood, or that they would be content with a single flood event either. Now take a look at these two photos. The one at the left, on the left, shows the effect of erosion on a small scale. You can stand in it. Dongas are usually formed due to the effect of a lot of water over a relatively short period of time. Now look at the photo on the right of the Fish River Canyon. Can you see the effect of a lot of water and a little time? The creationist and the evolutionist therefore are looking at the same evidence, the valley, the canyon. But the color of their lenses, their preconceived idea, differ. Because of the global flood, which covered the whole earth, there were once much larger volumes of water in our rivers. Today it is common to see the remaining small streams flowing between steep, high cliffs in these enormous canyons. The vast bodies of water that flowed outward over the continents after the flood caused an enormous amount of soil and sediments to be washed away. It was erosion 101. When keeping the flood in mind, it is quite easy to imagine how fast-moving bodies of eroding water rapidly carved out these landscapes. Further evidence is seen in the vast amounts of sediments laid down over huge lower-lying areas by these rivers. The canyons with their small streams are a constant reminder of this phenomenal event. The evidence is clear when we look at the mountains, plains, deserts, and waterways today. The huge bodies of flowing water and sediments also buried an enormous amount of plants and animals. In places, the fossil-bearing sedimentary rock layers are kilometers deep. What makes more sense to you? That a huge amount of water formed the canyons quickly, or a little river over a very, very long time? The conditions, and consequently the processes, clearly weren't always constant as taught in uniformitarianism. Now the ripple marks that form that we see on a sandy beach are simply mini sand dunes, but they can also form underwater. Ripple marks provide evidence for the rapid deposition of sedimentary layers, with an upper layer being immediately deposited over the lower layer, which contains the ripples, and this eliminates many millions of years of gap time. If millions of years had passed between these layers, the ripple marks would be eroded before a subsequent layer could be deposited. Now back to my rock that we discovered one morning while enjoying a kloofing expedition in the Bagalisberg Mountains. After the ripples were formed, the ripple layer was quickly covered by another layer of sediment before the ripple marks could erode away. These layers hardened over time, and at some point this boulder fell down the canyon and split open exactly there where those two layers used to be adjoined, especially for us to see. According to Gordon Davidson, sedimentary structures such as cross-bedding and ripple marks are plentiful in the Witwatersrand supergroup and are the same as structures seen in the flood deposits where visible life is present, as explained. This is called the Phanerozoic layers. Now furthermore, ripple marks preserved in rock layers are also water current indicators. These kind of layers cover huge areas all across North and South America, and they show that water currents were consistently flowing from northeast to southwest. Of course, it would take some stretch of imagination to think that the water had been flowing in the same general direction over such a vast area for 300 million years. It's only possible if these rock layers with their similarly orientated ripple marks were deposited over a few weeks during the global flood in the time of Noah. The discovery of a dominant direction of current flow through major portions of the Phanerozoic of North America strengthens the concept of a single flood catastrophe. Under ordinary conditions, water flows in different directions, such as occurs in the various rivers on present-day continents. But if the continents were submerged underwater during a worldwide flood, one might expect current flow to tend in one direction. Marine sedimentary rocks are far more common and widespread on land today than all other kinds of sedimentary rocks combined. This is one of those simple facts that fairly cry out for explanation and that lie at the heart of man's continuing effort to understand more fully the changing geography of the geologic past. I want to round off the discussion on the geologic table by attempting to put it into perspective, especially with regards to theistic evolutionists. The whole of creation groans in slavery to corruption, awaiting Christ's final redemptive work at his second coming. From the word, it is clear that corruption is a bad thing. Yet those who believe that life has been around for hundreds of millions of years must believe what the evolutionist claims, namely that 5 major massive extinction events, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, preceded mankind's arrival on the planet. At each of those times, 65 to 90% of all species on Earth went extinct. If this is true, what impact did the fall have on creation? None. In fact, if death, bloodshed, disease, and extinction really did occur for millions of years before mankind's arrival, then the very good creation of Genesis 1 was considerably worse than the world we now inhabit. The curse should then actually be viewed as a blessing, since the earth has not seen a 65 to 90% extinction of all species since Adam sinned. In this scenario, the post-fall world is more creature-friendly than the very good pre-fall world. So to what state will Jesus restore the groaning creation in the future? Pre-fall or post-fall? Because if we look at this through the theistic evolutionist lens, then the present state of affairs, taking cognizance of the massive extinctions before sin, is considerably better than before the fall. The cosmic impact of Christ's final redemptive work has been the orthodox Christian view for the last 2,000 years. The idea of millions of years of animal death before man contradicts the Bible's teaching about the nature of the pre-fall creation and the present world. It also assaults the character of God, and it undermines the certain hope the Bible gives of Christ's future redemptive work. Now clearly, there are serious problems with a millions of years old earth idea. Let's have a look at some more examples. Every year, about 25 billion tons of soil and rock material are washed into the sea from the continents due to wind and water erosion. This material accumulates as sediments on the ocean floor. The average depth of all sediments in the ocean is approximately 400 meters. Plate tectonic subduction has been identified as one very important way that this sediment is removed from the ocean floor. This happens when the sea floor slowly slides beneath the continents, taking some sediments with it. And we'll look at this in more detail in the next lecture. Now, secular scientific literature indicates that this process currently removes only about 1 billion tons per year. If the oceans really were 3 billion years old, this process of erosion would by now have caused the 24 billion tons per year accumulation to completely choke up the ocean with sediments. At this rate, erosion would have deposited this amount of sediment in less than 12 million years. Because the continents erode so rapidly, all the continents should have eroded away many times over if the Earth really was billions of years old. The average height reduction for all the continents of the world is about 60 millimeters per 1,000 years. Old Earth scientists generally accept that the continents formed at least 2.5 billion years ago. If the Earth was really billions of years old, a height of 150 kilometers of continent would have eroded in 2.5 billion years. It simply makes no sense, since no continents would remain on Earth if erosion has been going on for billions of years. Even at the slowest rate of 1 millimeter of erosion per 1,000 years, the continents with an average height of 623 meters would have vanished a long time ago. The evolutionists' own preconceived idea of uniformitarianism, that the rate of erosion has always been the same, actually works against their own hypothesis. The Earth's magnetic field is weakening at an increased rate. It's decaying too fast. Records have been kept of measurements taken since 1829, and this indicated that the total energy of Earth's magnetic field has declined. Research done by the physicist Professor Dr. Thomas Barnes in 1970 noted that measurements since 1835 indicated that the intensity of Earth's magnetic field have weakened by 5% every 100 years. He suggested that this decline was due to the decay of electrical current in Earth's magnetic core. He further calculated that this current could not have decayed for more than 10,000 years because the original intensity would have been so great that the Earth would have melted. We will refer to this again in the lecture on radiometric dating. The Niagara Ravine extends for about 11 kilometers. The French explorer Hennepin started to map these falls for the first time in 1678. From then until 1842, these falls eroded at a rate of 2.13 meters per year. More recent measurements from 1842 to 1927 indicated a rate of erosion of between 1.2 to 1.5 meters per year. With realistic estimates of erosion rate, this would bring the age of the ravine to about 4,400 years. The fact that the speed was initially even higher relates to the period after Noah's flood, when there was an even greater flow of water in the river for a while, when enormous amounts of water streamed off the continents, leading to the very high erosion rates. This is supported by the fact that the gorge is much narrower than the existing falls, only a quarter to a half its width. Narrower falls means a greater flow of water over the edge and much faster erosion. It's interesting to note that Charles Lyell, the father of the geologic column, declared that these falls are 35,000 years old, after deliberately adjusting his calculations. It's just a nice way of saying that he lied. Unfortunately for him, there were eyewitnesses who, through their direct observations, pointed out his faulty maths. Caves mostly occur in limestone or dolomite formations, which are found in almost every country. The general old earth view is that caves such as the Kango caves are millions of years old due to the so-called slow formation of stalagmites and stalactites within them. Stalactites form downwards from the roof, while stalagmites form from the ground upwards in caves. The carbonic acid in water is able to gradually dissolve the minerals within the limestone and dolomite formations. The reaction between the carbonic acid water and limestone or dolomite results in the formation of bicarbonate products. Stalactites and stalagmites are formed if the water containing the bicarbonates drips slowly into an underground cavern. The obvious next question is, how long does it take for them to grow? Growth rates of several centimeters per year have been measured. A limestone stalagmite of 1.6 meters high was discovered in an old gold mine tunnel in Australia. It can't be older than 150 years. Stalactites also hang under the Van Staden's Bridge, as well as in the basement parking lot of the State Theatre in Pretoria. So either that State Theatre is a millions of years old, or stalactites grow much faster than you are being told. Ken Ham tells of a cave in Queensland, Australia, that is located in a particularly dry environment, so that the formation of stalactites should be particularly slow. During the 1890s, a few boardmen used to blast these stalactites to pieces with a shotgun. By 1980, these stalactites managed to grow back by 15.24 centimeters. An underground tunnel in London, unused since 1945, was reopened after 33 years. Ian Taylor took a photo of stalactites as long as 61 centimeters. The rate at which they form will vary depending on the circumstances and the amount of water. Natural coral reefs are formed when tiny marine animals called polyps use their lime secretions to build the structure that they live in. These structures eventually becomes meters high and can be many kilometers long. The foundation is always on rock. Now, most coral animals can only survive in shallow, a few meters deep, warm waters. No coral growth takes place under 50 meters because of the limited light. The general old earth view is that the coral reefs are millions of years old because of their slow growth. But it's been proven over and over again that this growth can happen rapidly. The growth is influenced by the influx of fresh seasonal water. It has been determined that reefs of 1.8 meter grew within only 118 years. The Great Barrier Reef's thickest measurements of 55 meter is hereby calculated at less than 3,700 years old. Not all of the limestone formations are derived from coral reefs, though. The White Cliffs of Dover extend way beyond the interior of England and are also present just on the other side of the English Channel, on the French coastline. These type of chalk deposits are the same in North America, in Australia, Europe, Asia, and Africa. The Latin word for chalk is creta, which is why geologists refer to this formation as the Cretaceous period in the geologic column. The calcium carbonate content in chalk is very high, between 90 and 98%. It consists of tiny fossilized shells of billions of microscopic microorganisms set in a matrix of fine-grained calcium carbonate. The limestone deposits of the world could only have been deposited in relatively shallow water because the calcium carbonate within would have dissolved in deeper oceans, further evidence that the world was once underwater. According to the old Earth view, this limestone material accumulated on the ocean floor over millions of years and was later exposed when the sea floor was uplifted during the formation of the continents and large islands. However, you've just learned that these types of depositions can only form in shallow water. The Dover Formation is approximately 405 meters thick. It's almost a half a kilometer. Why is it so thick? Well, today it's known that the population growth of microorganisms which eventually form chalk varies greatly, depending on water turbulence, wind, the presence of rotting fish, nutrients, and high temperatures, all factors that occurred during the flood. These cliffs are eroding at a rate of 1 meter every 6 years. Geologists believe that the cliffs are 65 million years old. However, if the cliffs have been eroding over such a long time, at an average of 1 meter every 6 years, more than 10,000 kilometers would have already eroded away. That's almost the distance from London to Cape Town. Isn't it shocking how easily people simply dish up the words millions of years? The truth is clear. These long periods make absolutely no sense based on the processes we can observe and measure today. It does, however, fit 100% into the process that have taken place over the last 4,500 years. Let's finalize by looking at how long it takes for something to petrify or turn to stone. Most people believe that it takes millions of years for rocks to form and harden. But after a corn mill in the USA was flooded with mineralized water, a bag of flour petrified. It turned to stone in only a few weeks. Ship bells were discovered a mere 50 meters from Victoria in Australia. The bells were completely encased in rock. Of course, you know that the ship's clocks are not millions of years old. The name of the sailboat was the Isabella Watson, and she sank in 1852. Still, people believe that millions of years are required for rocks to form, but all that's really required are the right ingredients. Another example is this old bottle that is completely encased in stone. In the past, it used to be you could view it at the Maritime Museum in Cape Town in South Africa. On closer inspection, a whole bunch of other items were also discovered encased in rock, including a ceramic mug, iron products, pebbles, fragments of seashells. Now, such rock-solid evidence confirms once more that a few thousand years is more than sufficient for the sedimentary strata to have hardened. Look at this fossilized hat, which belonged to a miner and was discovered in Tasmania. The hat was covered in water for 50 years. During that time, the water escaped through the hat, leaving behind a calcium carbonate precipitate, turning the soft hat into stone. Chris and Sandra Barnes got a bit more than expected when they went for a late afternoon walk on the shore at Victoria Point, Brisbane, Australia. Hidden inside a rock that looked like any other rock on the shore, they discovered a miniature plastic toy car, totally enclosed in stone. The car cannot be more than 10 to 20 years old. There are many other examples, and you can have a look on creation.com, but now you know. It certainly does not take long, definitely not millions of years, for something to petrify or for rocks to form. Let's summarize. When looking at all the facts, it becomes so very clear that there was once a worldwide flood. It is also clear that the long periods of sedimentary layer formation proposed by old Earth scientists simply never existed, and that there is no evidence of evolution from less complex to more complex organisms in the fossil record. The flood was such a massively catastrophic event that the effects thereof can still be seen today all over the earth, in the air, and also in the life forms. Mount St. Helens provide clear evidence of rapid sedimentary layer and canyon formation. Formed by a volcanic eruption in 1963, the island of Surtsey near Iceland has intrigued scientists because it looks like landscapes most think are much older. According to a New Scientist article, the island has excited geographers and who marveled at these canyons and gullies and other land features that usually take tens of thousands, even millions of years to form, and yet it was created in less than a decade. Biologists have also marveled at how quickly plants and animals and birds have colonized this island. The Icelandic Institute of Natural History put it this way: we now have a fully functional ecosystem on Surtsey. Now, if you were to visit Surtsey and you were unaware that it was less than 50 years old, I wonder how old you would imagine it was. The next time you hear that a particular landscape took millions of years to form, remember the island of Surtsey, because things can look much older than they really are. We come back to the sedimentary strata of the world. It contains enormous amounts of fossils. Without a worldwide flood, it would have been impossible for such enormous amounts of plants and animals to be buried rapidly. And if they weren't buried rapidly, very importantly, they would not have been able to fossilize, since they would have either been scavenged or decayed before fossilization could occur. It must have happened rapidly. That process only took place once on such a large scale in the history of the world. The evidence is overwhelming. It was a worldwide event. The existence of the fossil record can only be explained by considering the catastrophic flood when the largest and single most important worldwide burial ever took place. Think of the sedimentary strata as the cemetery of Noah's flood. In the next presentations, we'll take a look at the details of the flood as well as the logistics of Noah's Ark. Thank you very much.